Witch Hat Atelier is the perfect blend of magic and science. It gives readers a world in which the characters experiment with magic and use it to creatively solve their problems. In this sense, the story plays out less like Black Clover and more like Dr. Stone. But unlike Dr. Stone, Witch Hat takes place in a fantasy world with flying carriages and these cute little penguin griffin things. So in a bizarre fantasy world like this, how could the realistic science of Dr. Stone possibly apply to Witch Hat? Well, before I explain exactly what I mean, just be aware that there's some minor spoilers ahead for anyone who hasn't started the story. Now, with that out of the way, let's look at how the magic of Witch Hat actually works. In Witch Hat, spells aren't just enchantments given life through the spoken word. Here, they're drawings, specifically seals drawn with conjuring ink, which gives us rule number 1. If the seal isn't drawn with conjuring ink, then it won't activate. Now, you might think this is like the game Scribblenauts, where you can just conjure up whatever recipe for chaos you're thinking of. But that's not exactly how it works. In Witch Hat, each seal needs to have 3 parts. A sigil in the center that determines the basic nature of the spell, a sign around the sigil to determine the direction and size of the spell, and finally, an outer ring to fix the spell and activate it. So you could use your conjuring ink and draw the most elaborate harmony of sigils and signs. But if it isn't completed with a ring, then the seal won't be complete. By manipulating these 3 elements, a witch can translate different seals into their desired spells. And if they continue to study these elements and experiment with different combinations, then a witch can invent a spell of their own design. If it sounds simple, it's because it is. There's more nuances to the system that are explained in later chapters, but I'll let you discover most of those on your own. Now, back to what I said earlier, this is what makes Witch Hat more like Dr. Stone and less like Black Clover. Black Clover has magic, but that magic plays out more like Dragon Ball. All the characters need to do is train and they can overcome their obstacles using their many, many muscles. In contrast, the characters in Dr. Stone need to solve different problems with new tools or modified versions of their old tools. So with a system like the one in Witch Hat, it's more in line with something like Dr. Stone. While the witches obviously gain experience as they draw more spells, that experience doesn't mean they can just level up their spells by working their bench press and eating lots of cream puffs for extra calories. They need to actually figure out how to change the structure of the spell to fit their particular problem. And in this sense, magic is a learned ability. Rather than an innate ability you either have or don't, it's something anyone can study in nature. And here's where we can start to make connections between Witch Hat and Dr. Stone. At one point in Dr. Stone, Senku and the other characters explore a hypothetical where ghosts are real. He points out that ghosts could only be real if they produced some kind of replicable phenomenon. The reason for that is that rules equal results. One of the first things Senku says in Dr. Stone is that science is all about understanding rules and applying them. It's the classic if-then statement. By observing replicable results in nature, you can determine the rules that influence them. Vice versa, if you know what the rule is, then you can reproduce those results. Now, in the case of Witch Hat, we already have 4 rules: ink, sigil, sign, and ring. With these 4 simple rules, the story presents us with plenty of if-then statements. If you use a water sigil, then you'll get a water spell. If you use a different sign, then you'll get a different water spell. By grounding it in clear rules, Witch Hat presents readers with a system of magic that could believably exist in our world if the same conditions were in place. Like any other force of nature, this magic can only be reproduced under the right conditions. It isn't something where the characters can just do whatever they want and the only explanation is that it's magic. But at this point, I'm sure you're thinking that all of these rules must make the magic of Witch Hat pretty restrictive. On the contrary, these rules make the magic that much more creative. To show you how this works, let's explore just a couple of examples of how obstacles are approached in Witch Hat. Actually, before I do that, I want to just give a quick shout out to this comment of the week on my previous video on Eden Zero. If you'd like me to share your comment in the next video, then make sure to share your thoughts on Witch Hat down below. With that out of the way, let's look at how the characters express their creativity through problem solving. As apprentices, witches are given a number of tests that allow them to move up through the ranks. The first test the main character Coco is given is the Consent of the Crown. In this test, Coco needs to pick a flower from the highest floating hill. Now, before this test, Coco's teacher, Master Kifri, showed her the 3 basic elements of every spell. After learning about the elements, Coco attempts to reproduce Master Kifri's water spell. But instead of a nice ball of water, her spell leads to a not-so-nice hydro pump to the face. As the other characters point out, Coco's spell shot out the way it did because one of the signs was longer than the others, causing an uneven balance of pressure in the seal. Fast forward back to the test, and Coco uses this accidental lesson to her advantage. When she loses the sylph shoes that allow a witch to fly on their feet, Coco comes up with her own way to fly. First, she replaces the water sigil from her old spell with a wind sigil. Then, instead of the more conventional design where a sigil is surrounded by a circle of signs, Coco fills the ring of the seal with the sigil and one long sign. As a result, Coco's new wind spell mimics the more directed effect of her water spell from earlier, allowing her to fly her sailboat with its very own gust of wind. So here's where we can see how using rules to solve problems breeds creativity. In the case of the water spell, Coco inadvertently learned a new rule about signs. She then took that rule and replicated it to create a new spell. Without that guiding principle, there wouldn't have been any way for Coco to replicate what she saw before. Instead of limiting what she can do, these rules actually serve as the foundation for Coco's creativity. One other thing I'd like to point out is the nature of Coco's test. Notice that Coco was never told exactly how she needed to get the flower. While she could only pass if she got the flower, there weren't any rules for how she did that. Just keep that in mind for later since it ties into this idea of creativity. Now, later in the story, Coco gets overwhelmingly sick and her friend Tarta rushes to find her some medicine. The only problem is that Tarta is colorblind. While he knows a lot about potions and ingredients, he relies on labels to know what's inside a container. But when he gets to the inventory room, none of the containers are labeled. Since he can't think of anything else to do, Tarta decides to move on and get Coco some water. But when he does that, he remembers how his grandfather uses the same water spell to mix ink. So, Tarta decides to use the water spell to separate the ingredients and identify the solids. Here, Tarta does like Coco and uses a past experience to produce a new result. But this time, instead of altering the spell itself, Tarta just repurposes the same spell. With his vast knowledge of different ingredients, Tarta uses the same old if-then formula we've been using. If Tarta separates the ingredients with water, then he can identify the solids. Unfortunately, Tarta can only reduce the ingredients to their powder forms, which essentially tells him nothing since, oh yeah, he's sorta kinda still colorblind. At this point, Coco steps in and takes the process one step further with another new spell. In an earlier part of the story, Coco was shown that one particular spell was capable of reducing stones to sand. So, using that spell and her general knowledge of signs, Coco proposes the following hypothesis. If I reverse the signs, then instead of breaking an ingredient, the spell should return it to its original form. Think Crazy Diamond from JoJo's Part 4. Fortunately, with a little fine-tuning, Coco's new spell does exactly that, and Tarta manages to find what he needs. While Coco's thinking here is similar to her thought process from the Consent of the Crown, it's actually a step forward in the sense that she didn't just replicate what she saw. Instead, she developed a new hypothesis by considering what would happen if she changed one element of the previous spell. Here, Coco expresses her creativity by taking something she learned and using her own ideas to see how she can create something new. But that's not the only way this was an exercise in creativity. On top of the fact that one of the characters is literally colorblind, you would think using magic with all of these rules would be pretty limited. But just like before, those restraints only inspire creativity. Notice how Coco and Tarta each approach the same problem in their own way. Tarta with his knowledge of ingredients and Coco with her knowledge of magic. Better yet, just think about the very nature of this problem. Remember how there was no right way to get the flower in the Consent of the Crown? Well, there was no right way to find the ingredients. Literally, the only rule in this situation was just make sure you find the ingredients. Beyond that, Coco and Tarta were essentially given their own sandbox where they were free to solve the problem however they wanted. For example, instead of the spell Coco actually came up with, she could have used a clairvoyance spell that would point her in the direction of the ingredients. But she didn't, and neither did Tarta. And that's okay. because there's rarely one single way to solve a problem in science. Of course, some things like grade school math problems will only have one right answer, but even then there's different ways to count the math. Some people might do long division. Others might use the bizarre witchcraft otherwise known as the lattice method. But there's no single way to find the answer as long as you can still solve the problem. So in the face of rules and laws of nature, a person is rarely ever restricted by objectivity. Those rules are the foundations for experimentation that lead to personal creativity, which is exactly what we can see in Witch Hat. But fortunately, this isn't the only way Witch Hat highlights the creative nature of science. We already discussed one takeaway from Dr. Stone that's used in Witch Hat, but there's another one that's even more important to both stories, and is considered to be one of the most meaningful approaches to modern science. That is the idea of elegance. While I'm strongly of the opinion that you can enjoy a story without considering the author's intentions, an approach in literature known as the death of the author, one particular comment from the creator of Witch Hat highlights a theme in the story that pops up again and again. At the end of Volume 1, series author Kamome Shirahama explains that she was inspired to write Witch Hat after a friend told her bringing an illustration into the world feels like magic. Naturally, when creating Witch Hat, Shirahama wanted to present a story where the characters' illustrations left an enchanting impression on the other characters as well as the readers. In some ways, you can see how the story is directly connected to art. The spells take the form of illustrated seals, and the witches study in ateliers, workshops especially meant for artists. In other ways, the connections to art are not so direct. Beyond the skill needed to make seals, the characters don't really focus on improving their artistic talent. They don't study color theory, they don't consider the perspective of their seals, and they don't need to worry about which part of the seal your eyes are drawn to. So with all of these differences, how exactly does Shirahama replicate the magic of illustrating? Well, this is where we can turn to Dr. Stone again. One particularly iconic catchphrase in Dr. Stone comes from the villain Dr. Zeno Houston Wingfield. As an eccentric mad scientist, Dr. Zeno loves, and I mean loves, to say that science is elegant. Now, I don't want to spend too much time explaining this, since I already did a more in-depth video on it, but here's the two things that are important for reading Witch Hat. First, elegance in the context of science refers to an idea that is so basic or fundamental that it can be used to understand other scientific principles. For example, in Witch Hat, the simple structure of seals would be considered elegant. Second, scientists have observed that the part of our brains that reacts to pieces of art is the same one that reacts to math equations. So we as humans get the same subjective value out of art as we do science. We enjoy seeing the different details of a painting come together just like we enjoy building a machine or breaking it apart and learning how it works. In other words, science is a form of art. You can see it in the way Coco takes the rules of magic and uses them to create spells. Not only do the other characters enjoy seeing her spells, but like any artist, Coco gets a sense of fulfillment out of seeing her ideas elegantly work together. But Dr. Stone isn't the only manga you can compare to Witch Hat. In keeping with the theme of art, one manga where you can see the same kind of elegance is Blue Period. In that manga, you can see the main character learn about the different rules of art and use them to make something new, just like Coco. Point is, this is how Witch Hat illustrates the creative nature of science. While all the rules might make it seem purely objective by nature, this sort of arm's-length view of science doesn't even come close to capturing the full picture. Science is all about observing the world around us and using what we learn to replicate it and make something brand new. Instead of limiting how we express ourselves, these rules allow each of us to solve complex problems in our own unique way. Coco finds her own identity in her journey of learning these rules and making them her own, and Tarta finds a sense of freedom after using those same rules to overcome his limitations. While they might seem like two entirely different things, science and art each give us a sense of purpose by helping us to appreciate the little details of the universe. By capturing this idea and using it to craft an incredible story, Witch Hat Atelier offers the perfect example of science and its subjective beauty. And that's it for this discussion. As you can tell, I get pretty crazy when it comes to science. So hopefully I helped you see why I love Witch Hat so much. If I did, then make sure to let me know by liking the video. Also, make sure to comment with your thoughts on the magic of Witch Hat down below. And if you'd like more discussions on science and manga like this one, then make sure to subscribe and follow along with each week's video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.